Please welcome Maxine Joselow, climate policy reporter, and Senator Brian Schatz.
Senator Schatz, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the trip from DC. So I had questions I wanted to start with, and then Secretary Chris Wright spoke, and I wanted to see if you might want to respond to some of the points that he raised. So what was your response?
Look, I think a lot of people were hopeful that Secretary Wright was going to be this pragmatist, that even if you were sort of climate action oriented, that he was a guy who understood energy systems and could kind of work through some of the technical challenges that are very real, that are not made up. He seems to have become a little bit more ideological over the last 8 months, and that's a bit troubling. And even the things that he says about the intermittency and the need for baseload power, all true, but they're kind of like, I feel like I'm in 1999 in the Hawaii legislature, and the Hawaiian Electric Company is testifying that the maximum penetration of intermittent renewables on the grid is 15% and no more. Like, he's arguing with a straw man. Most people who are in the climate space, who are in the clean energy space, understand that we need baseload power, understand that battery storage technology is improving but has not actually supplanted the need for baseload power, and that's why we're trying to invest so much in geothermal and nuclear power. So my general observation is that he was positioning himself as a pragmatist, but now he's ideological and trying to target the cheapest and easiest to install energy that is available to us in the next 5 to 10 years.
And what did you make of the Secretary's specific argument that he is not advocating for an all-of-the-above approach to energy policy? He's just advocating for an approach that doesn't provide subsidies to renewables like wind and solar.
Yeah, I mean, you get into what's a subsidy, right? And I think everyone is familiar with these arguments where the ITC and the PTC are subsidies, but the subsidies that the oil and gas exploration industry avails themselves are somehow not subsidies in the Internal Revenue Code. They're all subsidies, right? And so again, it's a very interesting position. I've been in the climate space for now 25 years professionally, and I have had to make an argument, which I always thought was right, but a little harder to make, that we needed to, account for negative externalities, invest in the future, and all the rest of it. But I could never look people right in the eyeball and say the thing that we are installing right now is going to save you money immediately. And the thing that has changed over the last 10 months or so is that wind is cheap, solar is cheap, battery storage is cheap, and nuclear and geothermal are great. And I'm a huge bull on them, but they're not ready in terms of just project cost and project risk and getting them off the ground. And we all know that natural gas is inexpensive, but I think has spiked by far, exceeding the rate of inflation over the last 12 months. So now I get to look people in the eye and say, you don't need to make a sacrifice on behalf of the planet in order to save money on your electricity bill. The cheapest, most immediate way to get relief is to install as much solar in particular as possible.
So I want to follow up on what you just said. It sounded like you were talking about how there needs to be a shift in the way that people talk about climate action, and maybe less of framing it in terms of a sacrifice that people need to make and more framing it in terms of the energy savings and the cost savings. Do you think Democrats need to talk differently about climate change?
I think, first of all, I think we should talk differently about almost everything. But I was thinking about this, and I'm in this world, right? So this is not a criticism necessarily of other people, but even I kind of have to watch how I'm talking. But I think about the technical stuff is the technical stuff because we're talking to fellow professionals in the space. But mitigation, adaptation. I was talking to Kate Gallego, the mayor of Phoenix, and I said, how are people feeling about climate issues? And she said, people want solar because it's cheap and they want relief from the heat, right? Now, there's a way to say that is relatable, which is exactly what she said, right? Or you could talk about the planetary emergency and mitigation and adaptation, and you could throw in some environmental justice rhetoric, and by the time you're done talking, people think you don't care about them. And so I do think that we have a generational opportunity as people who care about the climate to kind of reframe this so people don't have to assume that we are asking you to sacrifice on behalf of the planet. Because what the Secretary of Energy is doing, what the Trump administration is doing, is creating a shortage of electrons, and they are extending the life of the most expensive electrons that you can possibly buy. That's ideology, right? And if the added sort of a downside of their actions is it also is destroying the planet, I'm willing to talk about that. And of course, it's an animating force in my professional life. But you have to, I mean, my buddy, former governor Neil Abercrombie used to say, people vote for you for their reasons, not yours. And so I think the climate movement should not seek vindication. They should seek victory. And the way to victory is to talk about price.
So let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the messaging around that. Folks in this room, I'm sure know. But...
It worked perfectly.
End panel. So this is the signature Democrats' 2022 climate law, provided very generous tax credits for green technologies like solar panels, electric vehicles, et cetera. And the conventional wisdom among many Democrats that I talked to at the time was that this law was going to create this boom in jobs, largely in red states. And that was a lot of the messaging around it. And the wisdom went that this law would be safe from repeal because it'd be hard to argue against more jobs. And yet, in July, the Republican-controlled Congress repealed many of those credits as part of President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. Was there anything Democrats could have done differently in messaging? And take us inside, your behind-the-scenes conversations on the Hill with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle on that.
Someone asked me this afternoon, shouldn't you have done this on a bipartisan basis? And my answer to that is, sure. You should always pursue bipartisanship where it's possible, but bipartisanship should be a means to an end. It's not a fetish, to be sort of treated like it's an end. And so if Republicans were not going to provide votes for climate action, that I thought it was our obligation to take action anyway. The messaging was obviously, I think it was, let me put it this way. Usually when you pass a bill of this magnitude, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or in this case, most recently, the Big Beautiful Bill, there's almost immediately a voter backlash against it. And the IRA did not experience a voter backlash because it was not unpopular. So they said, look, this is an overreach and Democrats are going to, lose the chambers. And the truth was that although we didn't do well politically, this was not the reason. The reason was that prices were up everywhere, and we had a standard bearer who most people thought was not up to the job. So I think it is important for the climate movement to be realistic about the fact that we got our butts kicked in the last 6 months. Absolutely. I am very, very aware of the emerging cottage industry among Democratic strategists who who think they have a new theory of the case, a new silver bullet. I think we all have to kind of collect ourselves, listen to regular folks. And I do think it starts with pointing at what is going wrong right now and recapturing momentum with regular people who are watching their utility bills spike like a hockey stick, and they're pissed off about it. And we don't have to be overly complicated. In a midterm, you don't have to be overcomplicated. You don't have to necessarily paint a vision for the future. That's for the presidential cycle. But in a midterm, have you had enough is a very historically successful message.
So speaking of midterms in politics, polling consistently finds that climate change is not a top priority for many voters. When they're asked to rank their priorities, it's often immigration, the economy, healthcare, et cetera. Is climate change a losing issue politically?
No, it's not a losing issue. It's just never going to be one that cracks the top, three. When you ask them, even people who care a lot about climate, if you get polled and you say, what's the most important issue? You say, well, healthcare, the economy, democracy, whatever it is. Very few people prioritize climate as their sort of abiding issue. And so I think we just have to work through that. Again, people vote for you for their reasons, not yours. And I think the Democratic Party has to demonstrate that we're committed to climate action, but we're committed to climate action in the context of alleviating people's economic pain. And I think that is not something that we were particularly good at doing. And we painted a picture, like you say, of some broader industrial policy questions, which were interesting enough, But if you're a regular person and like bananas are up and gas is up and booze is up and coffee is up, then you're sort of saying, I don't know what that all means between IIJA and CHIPS and the IRA. It just sounds like you're kind of tinkering with the economy at the K Street and Wall Street level, and I'm still paying and I still can't do it. And so I think we need to just simplify it and remove the part of our brains that wants to over-explain and over-engineer our politics.
And speaking of rising prices, you've alluded to this a bit, and it's been a theme throughout the conversations today, but electricity prices are rising, despite the fact that President Trump campaigned on a promise to lower energy costs, including gas and electricity costs. How much do you pin the blame on the Trump administration's policies versus other factors that are at play here, like the build-out of data centers for AI?
Well, look, I mean, you can explain it away, but I think when you're explaining, you're losing. And I think it's very interesting that Secretary Wright over the last 3 or 4 weeks or so has sort of gotten into a defensive posture about like, well, that was Biden policy and blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, everybody understands when you cancel projects that are 85% done, when you cancel projects that are going to deliver a price point that is lower than what most ratepayers are currently paying, like people are not stupid. They may not be experts in the energy space, but they know a shortage when they see one. And I think Trump's economic policy it sort of seems incoherent, but it's shortages. That's the policy, right? It's shortages of electrons, shortages of healthcare, shortages of food, shortages of building materials, shortages of labor. He wants shortages because that is the position that puts him in the best perch to have people petition the monarch for a relief. And that is his political philosophy, and that has, in a certain way, always been his economic philosophy, which is a shrinking America allows him to control things a little bit better.
So you mentioned that the administration is canceling projects that are 85% complete. I think that may have been a reference to the offshore wind projects like Revolution Wind, which is about 80 or so % complete, and they issued a stop work order to it. Is it fair to say, though, that some of those moves haven't had consequences for electricity prices yet because that wind farm wasn't fully in operation yet?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a public utilities commissioner or a public service commissioner, so I'm not exactly sure. But I think it is what I've been told is that the spikes that we're experiencing right now are about to get worse because we still haven't gotten to the orders of magnitude increase in load, mostly because of data centers. And it was already going to be hard to meet that demand. And now we just took a bunch of things offline. So I think the price problem where electricity prices are now doubling the rate of inflation is unfortunately going to get a lot worse. And I think we should be unapologetic about saying shortages are bad and shortages drive the price up. And this thing called solar energy is the easiest way to put electrons on the grid in the short run. Everything else will take a while, right? Forget any ideology, forget whether you care about the climate or not. If you're a regular person looking for relief, you want a bunch of solar farms for your local utility to plug into.
So switching gears, we've talked a lot about domestic climate policy and politics. Internationally, you're a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. You've been to many COPs, the UN Climate Summit. The big news out of the UN today is China just announced its new NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution Climate Target, for the next several years. What is your reaction to what you've seen so far?
I'll have to dig in a little deeper, but from what I saw, it's pretty weak. It gives them flexibility to define when the peak is, and it's not much of a decrease off the peak. Now, if the peak is this year, that's a little better. But I think what's happening now is that the United States receding from the national stage is giving cover to China to do less. And I think that's one of the most critical problems here is that, you can talk about how the United States is some tiny percentage of global emissions, but we are still a fulcrum in the geopolitical sense. And once we sort of exit the stage as it relates to maybe the UNFCCC and certainly the NDC context, China feels a little bit less pressure to do as much as they may have been planning on doing. And I think that's a damn shame.
Just one acronym, since climate policy is full of acronyms, UNFCCC being the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Thank you. I figure these people know more than me.
I hope the audience, at least some of you know, but just for everyone out there. The criticism that you leveled against China's NDC, there is talk that it's a little squishy on peak emissions. At the same time, analysts are expecting China's emissions to peak this year.
Right. And so, I mean, again, we're going to need to see the details, but I think what the United States has done is created an opening for China to sort of position itself as a global leader in clean energy and do a lot less than they might have done were they in a direct competition with us.
So what you're saying is the U.S. not being at the table in the international climate space and President Trump withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement is, in your view, giving China some cover to put forward a less ambitious
That's what it appears like to me, yes.
So what are your expectations for COP30 in Belém this year without the U.S. potentially? So
I've been to a bunch of COPs. I've skipped a couple, but I've been to a bunch in the last 13 years. And, you know, in Trump 1.0, it was, you know, we're still in with the subnationals and all the rest of it. And I think climate mayors and climate governors and NGOs and all the rest of it and the tech community and the investment community, like they'll still do that. But now that I'm in my perch as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee and the ranking member on the Appropriations Subcommittee for State and Foreign Ops, I'm coming with a different message because I actually know some of these people well enough where I don't want to lose my credibility. So what I'm saying is we will be back, but do not wait for us. And that is a different message. I don't mean this like sort of in a sassy way. I really mean that it is not clear when the United States will return to the global stage and to global leadership on climate. And we shouldn't pretend that we know or pretend that we're certainly coming back in 3 years. This is a planetary crisis. There are plenty of global leaders who actually are prioritizing climate action, and we should allow them to do it because the kind of almost psychological dynamic, the social dynamic in these COPs and in any kind of UN convening is people still really want to know what the Americans are thinking. And I think at this point, people are better, they should talk to us, they should talk to the sort of government in exile, they should figure out who's doing interesting stuff, they should talk to markets and nonprofits and mayors and governors, but in the end, they should not intermediate their actions through the United States government because the United States government at this point is hostile to climate action.
So without the U.S. at COP, is there still hope for progress this year?
Absolutely. We're just going to need others to step up. And I think they will because I think, you know, the advantage and disadvantage of the United States as the indispensable nation is that people were always waiting for us. But there are a lot of people with some sort of, you know, dry powder to take some real actions, and they were waiting to see about cues from us. And I think the cue has been unmistakable. And my message to them is move on without us, and we'll join you when we can.
Isn't that a hard message, though?
Terrible message, but it's better than lying.
So on China and turning back to Congress, do you feel as though there's an appetite for bipartisan climate action when it's framed not necessarily in terms of climate per se and reducing emissions per se, but more in terms of competitiveness with China, boosting American industries and American manufacturing?
Yeah, I think, of course. I think permitting reform still has a fair amount of momentum. And I've been one of the folks in those permitting reform conversations. And it's become sort of like permitting reform is a placeholder for a bunch of stuff that people want. But if you really believe in the sort of inexorable nature of the clean energy transformation, you have to start to execute on the infrastructure because that's going to be the rate limiting factor probably, well, pretty soon, 5 to 10 years from now. So we've got to get going on permitting reform. I'll also say that in the big beautiful bill, which eviscerated a lot of the solar and wind credits, there were some, you know, there was a minor silver lining on the nuclear and geothermal and battery storage piece. And so to the extent that there was a thought process behind the BBB, they're basically betting on future technologies. Now, some of that was just a punt, but that is a deal space that I think we can continue to pursue because there are some darn conservative members of the Republican Party who still believe in geothermal and nuclear energy. And I think when the dust settles, they're going to come back to solar. And when Trump is no longer in office, they might even come back to wind.
We'll see if you're right in however many years. So on permitting reform, you and other Democrats and many Republicans have been a vocal advocate for fixing what many see as a broken permitting process in this country that makes it take way too long to build new infrastructure for energy, whether it's renewables or fossil fuels. Do you see room at all for a deal in this political environment on permitting reform in which Democrats need to give some concessions?
Yeah, and I mean, let me just get into the politics just very briefly. My sort of fellow travelers in the climate space are a number of people, but the two that I've been with for a long time are Martin Heinrich, who's the ranking member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and Sheldon Whitehouse from the Environment and Public Works Committee.
You called yourself the three climateers.
Yeah, I mean, Sheldon calls us the three climateers. I try not to, but you know, these are people with unvarnished climate action reputations, and they're the ranking members of the relevant committees. I'm not, but I'm in the leadership, and we're all very hawkish on permitting reform, and we're ready to have the difficult conversations with frankly, progressives who I think for very good reasons, and I come by this sort of political transformation, honestly, in the state of Hawaii, right? Like the environmental movement was always about stopping bad stuff, right? Someone wants to build a casino in Kawela Bay, stop it. Somebody wants to build a restaurant on the cliff at Makapu'u Lighthouse, no, stop it. And so all of the laws and habits of the mind and political ecosystems and organizations were set up to stop bad things. And all of those laws and rules and habits are now being weaponized against building the things that we need to build a more prosperous future. And by the way, that goes for wind and solar, but it also goes for housing. And so there's a transformation on the left that if we're going to be a party that has an economic theory of the case other than protecting the gains, that we have to be the party of construction. We have to be the party of not canceling things, but building things, and not funding things, but executing on them.
Well, I'm keeping an eye on the clock and want to be mindful of everyone's time. But final question, you know, climate change is often about doom and gloom and depressing headlines. I know that as a climate reporter. You know that as a lawmaker focused on climate. What is one thing right now that gives you optimism about climate?
Oh, the tech is like every time I get a briefing on the latest tech, that's the part that is the hockey stick, right? The policy is fits and starts, and I'm very proud of it. Look, if in a negotiation with Joe Manchin would have said, okay, I'll do all these wind and solar tax credits, but they've got to expire in 3.5 years, right? I would have taken that deal in a second. And that's basically where we are. So I'm not totally in the dumps about where we are on federal statutory law. But the thing that should give us all hope is that there are technological breakthroughs everywhere, and they just need to be funded and then scaled and deployed. And so I'll also just say, you know, wherever you are, it feels like the center of the universe, and it is important. And so when I'm in the fight, it's very binary. Did we pass the IRA and therefore save the climate? Well, that wasn't really true. We didn't save the climate. Or did they pass their bill and is the climate now forever doomed? Well, it's not so binary. And when you come to a climate week like this, you realize there are tons and tons of passionate and super bright professionals who do this full time. So we're going to win. I just don't know how quickly.
Senator Schatz, thank you.